Greetings from the Idiot Box, where we explore the good, the bad, and the wacky in television. I'm Allison Lips. Ben Alba joins us today. Ben is the author of Inventing Late Night, Steve Allen, and the original Tonight Show. Ben, is there anything else you want to add?
Well, hi, Allison. It's nice to be
Hi,
here with you.
this is the book.
Just wanted to mention that I am the Director of Academic Success at DePaul University College of Law as well, which is my day job.
Mm-hmm.
And it's great to be here to talk about late night with you.
I'm thrilled to have you here. So, we were talking a little bit before the podcast, and I am a huge Steve Allen fan. Um, I grew up watching The Tonight Show with Jay Leno, which then then I became a huge Conan fan and listening to Conan talk about how big of an influence Letterman was on him. I switched over to Letterman. Then listening to Letterman, Steve Allen is a huge influence on him. So that's how I ended up at Steve Allen, who
Yeah, good.
unfortunately there's not that much of his stuff that's out there that's easily accessible.
Right. Yeah, and you
But
certainly don't look old enough to be a Steve Allen fan from back then. And
no,
I would also have to say that that's slightly before my time. So it really does go back, to 1954.
yes. But like Steve Allen is probably not probably, he is one of my favorite late night hosts just from what I know. Obviously, like Conan, Letterman, Johnny Carson, there's a lot more out there, but Steve Allen is the guy who started it all. And you were saying like it's a little before your time. So why did you write a book about him?
That's a good question. And really, it was almost an accident the way this idea for the book came about, because my
Okay.
musical hero growing up was Andy Williams, the great American vocalist. We still hear him every year singing "It's the Most Wonderful Time of the Year"
Yes.
every holiday season. And so I grew up watching his television show on NBC. And I was such a big fan of his, and I actually got to know him personally. I did a little bit of work for him, in fact, writing liner notes for some of his CDs,
Oh, that's
and
cool.
able to do other things for him as well. So it was really an honor to be able to do that. And so as I got more interested in his history, I knew or I learned that he was one of the regular house singers of the original Tonight Show, hosted by Steve Allen. And I had
Yes.
been somewhat familiar with Steve Allen growing up too, because he would appear on TV fairly regularly, but I didn't follow him in that way.
Mm-hmm.
But as I got more and more interested in Andy's early career, I wrote a letter to Steve Allen. And I just asked him if it might be possible to have a chat with him and learn more about what it was like for Andy to be on the show during the very early years of television. And
Yes.
so he, to my surprise, wrote me back, and he said that he'd be interested in chatting with me if I either wanted to do a phone call or if I wanted to visit with him in Van Nuys, California. And of
Mm-hmm.
course, the opportunity was there, and I figured you can't turn that down. And so I flew over to Southern California, and I met up with him there. And that's where not only did he regale me with stories about Andy's experiences on the early Tonight Show and the early years of that show, but I could tell that he was saddened by the fact that hardly any video evidence, or very little, existed any longer of those grand, glorious
Yeah.
years. I mean, you could tell when he was talking about those early years that it just awakened a sense of joy and wonderful memories about the show. And so it occurred to me in reflecting about a week or two after the interview, I was thinking, and I wrote him back and I said, I think there ought to be a book written capturing the memories of all of the folks that were there on the ground floor of early late night television, and that I would like to help you if you could. I was actually trying to lobby to see maybe he'll let me do some work for him. And so essentially his response to that was, I don't really have the time to write a book about this, but if you want to take this project up, he didn't use these words, but in a way, the implication was that he would kind of help open some doors for me. And I was thinking, well, how do you turn that down? I mean, I
You
must have made
don't.
some kind of impression on him. And so, or maybe he was testing me to see if, would I actually follow through on all of that. So I said yes. I said, I'll be happy to try and do this. And before I knew it, I found myself interviewing Bill Harback, who was the producer of the show, and the writers, different people on the cast. So, I think a year later, I found myself interviewing Steve Lawrence and Edie Gourmet. And so the list started going on and on about all the great people that I grew up admiring.
Yeah.
And I couldn't believe that I would be interviewing them one by one, learning about not only about the history of early television, but
Yeah.
what it was like during that era too. I mean, what New York was like in the 50s, when the production team would be leaving. This is live, the
Yes.
Steve Allen Tonight Show, and they'd be leaving the Hudson Theater at about I think 1:30 or 2 in the morning, and walking down the street there in downtown Manhattan, kind of going
Hmm.
back and forth, going, "This is what I like about what happened," or "How did what do you think about this sketch?" And I was thinking, how cool is that to get that kind of an
Yeah.
insight? So that's the long answer to how I ended up writing this book. But it was really a journey, and it was an experience of a lifetime to be able to do that.
Yeah, that is amazing. That is um just in awe because I am much younger. Obviously, Steve Allen was not someone who I watched live actually in anything because even in I grew up watching the Game Show Network a lot. So he would make
Mm,
appearances
mhm.
on the Game Show Network, but those were from the 60s and 70s. And he was always out of place on those because he'd appear on things like Match Game and Tattletales.
Mhm.
And if you would know, but Steve Allen kind of had a very like I'm still not sure where the line was, but he felt very strongly about vulgarity and things he felt were vulgar.
Mhm.
So appearing on Tattletales and Match Game felt like an odd fit for him.
Yeah, I would say he respected comedians that were intelligent, that were witty,
Yeah.
that wanted to make a point, but vulgarity for vulgarity's sake, just to get a laugh, or a cheap
Right.
laugh, that's something that he was not a fan of.
No.
But I mean, at the other end, though, I mean, he respected Lenny Bruce, who was considered a
Yes.
blue comedian, and he had him on
Yes.
his television show because he had a great deal of admiration for him, and that there were things that he wanted to make a point about,
Mm-hmm.
and it was intelligent. So that's probably maybe where the line was drawn. I think there are other
Right.
shows that are available, including I've Got a Secret. I think that
Mm-hmm.
is from the 60s, and he hosted that show, and it was
Yes.
really popular. And if you look at some of the old, and I think these are all available on YouTube, What's My Line? That's
Mm-hmm.
actually, it started in the 50s, but it actually
Yes.
ran all the way through the early 70s. Uh, but
Yes.
uh, but What's My Line was sort of one of the launching pads for his early success, and it caught the attention of the country and of the
Yes.
NBC executives when they saw, how curious, how intelligent, how witty, and how charming, that combination there
Yes.
that he displayed, along with the other panelists in that show, because that's what you had to be able to do in order to make that show effective. And it's
Yes.
what I always liked about Steve was how he would downplay what that was all about, but he had so much of what they needed. But he said, really, all you have to do is play a parlor game with a bunch of
Mm-hmm.
other charming people, and then you get a few laughs, and everybody across the country loves it. But
Right,
it
and
was much
keeps
more than
asking
that.
you, is it bigger than a bread box for the
Yes,
rest of
I
your life?
mean, right, and and just saying that kind of offhand, and because of his spontaneity And that's
Yeah.
one of the great gifts that he had, was that he was both curious and spontaneous. So he could do things quickly. And he found that he had that talent because up until then, would you believe, and I don't know if you've caught this part of it in the book, but he was in his very, very early years extremely heavily scripted. And it takes a lot of time to be able to write
Yeah.
script after script to be able to fill radio time. And I think there was one
Yes.
time where he was doing kind of like the color commentary for a parade in Phoenix, and he was on top of a building. And all of a sudden, all of his notes that
Yeah.
he had carefully written down, with all of the rundown of who the order of the parade would be, they all blew away in the wind. And he
Hmm.
found himself having to be able to do it kind of off the cuff, which he discovered he could do.
Wasn't this
And
also when something happened with the parade and they were stuck? Or am I mixing
yes,
it up?
that's right.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right. You probably have read my book more recently than I have. And,
Yeah.
and I would say, yeah, that's one of the things that happened there.
Well,
And oh, no,
I
no,
did
go ahead.
reread the book, and there were things where I'm like, I know this, and then because I was rereading it after so long, I'm like, oh wait, this is where I learned that. But you were saying the parade where they stopped.
Yes, and had the parade where they stopped, and then on another radio show he had, and this is where he discovered something else that he could do. Doris
Hmm.
Day was supposed to be booked as one of the celebrity guests there on the show, and for some reason she was not able to make it. There was maybe some kind of mix-up with her agent, or something happened where she just didn't show up. And he had an audience there in the radio studio, and he wasn't really too sure what to do because he had already played both sides of her record when records
Hmm.
only had two sides and two songs. And he was wondering, now, what am I going to do here? And all of a sudden, it occurred to him that maybe if he couldn't interview her, he could go into the audience and interview the folks there. And so that entailed at that time having to drag this iron mic stand there into
Hmm.
the audience and go around talking to people. But he found and discovered that a nice, quick, witty exchange between him and somebody in the
Hmm.
audience would go over a lot better and have bigger laughs than the best scripted line with Bob Hope. And so
Yes.
that became another ingredient that he brought
It's the
to the
found
table.
comedy of it all.
Yeah. And extremely spontaneous and likable. I mean, it was very good-natured, lighthearted kind of comedy that he was able to do.
Yes. And we have a lot of the classic late night bits because of Steve Allen. We know, I mean, Karnak is probably more famous than the Question Man, but the Question Man is before Karnak.
Correct.
And then there's also the Man on the Street interviews, which younger viewers would know from jaywalking.
Jaywalking, right? And they combined that with between actual people on the street, which Steve would have fun interviewing, and then
Yes.
they would use their cast of comic actors to kind of play different roles that they would kind of blueprint. But the comic actors, which would include folks like in their early careers, Don Knotts, Louis Nye,
Mm-hmm.
and Tom Poston, would be the men on the street. And they
Yeah.
would be playing different characters, although Don's character typically would be somebody who was just very, very nervous,
So Barney
and
Fife,
I
basically.
which is essentially evolved into that. And I think
Yeah.
probably one of the most famous bits that he did was when Steve asked him what he did for a living, and he said, "I'm a bodyguard for Vice President Nixon." And to see him shaking like that there, it was just was so incongruous and so funny. And
Yeah.
then he also did a bit, and it was a recurring bit of a very nervous TV weathercaster. And so that grew, and that sort of furthered his reputation. Tom Poston specialized in the person who couldn't remember his name. He was a sort of kind of an obtuse kind of character. And then
Right.
Louis Nye was very flamboyant, and he coined the catchphrase "Hi ho, Steve Areno." So, and all of those guys were just really great guys to interview. They had great stories to tell and told them with great fondness. And it was nice to be able to meet with them.
That is very cool. And preparing for this, I was watching an ep- so I watched an interview of Steve with Letterman, and then an interview of Steve with Conan.
Hmm.
And I don't remember, or I don't think they said if the Man on the Street bit was made specifically for Conan or if they were just showing some, like a clip from some other show.
Hmm.
But it was Steve on the streets of New York asking people, like he would back in the day, only
Hmm.
we're talking early 90s. And he's going up to people like, would you vote for an avowed heterosexual?
Right. Uh,
So you know what I'm
oh yeah,
referring.
that was from 1984. Um,
Okay, so it was from an
and
old clip.
yeah, and it was great because
Yeah.
the way people understood it or the way they heard it or what they
Yeah.
didn't hear at the time, and you heard people, and these were all, I guess, New Yorkers.
Yeah.
The women sounded like Edith Bunker. And I remember, I think there was one of the women saying, "Oh no, sexual, no, I would never vote for that." And then there was a guy that when Steve asked him that question, and he just kind of looked down and said, very thoughtfully,
Yeah.
yes, yeah, I think I would, like that. And it was just, yeah, it was just that's classic Steve Allen.
Yeah, where you're just like, are
Mhm.
these people not hearing this? Or I guess if you have a TV camera shoved in your face on the
Mhm.
street, you're just going to be like, what's going on here?
Right. Right. There was one, and I wish I could remember the exact question, but they showed by comparison a clip from jaywalking, and he asked some teenage girls about something land, and I can't remember what, and it turned out that one of them thought that this was a place in Disneyland, and I really wish I could remember exactly what what it was that Jay was asking them, but it was hysterical to get the answer to that question being coming right out of left field like that. Do you know
That
what
hap-
I don't know if you've seen that or not.
I don't think. Maybe. I'm not 100% sure. I'm not a huge Leno fan, which you probably
Mhm.
gathered from who I watch. But I did grow up watching Leno.
Mhm.
So I've seen plenty of jaywalking. I don't remember that specifically.
Mhm. Yeah, no, that's out there somewhere. I'm not sure where, but it was I
Yeah.
mean, it was an honest answer to the question, but I think the person didn't quite understand the question.
No,
Mhm.
that happens a lot.
That's something that Steve Allen was able to do in terms of mining the
Yeah.
audience for comedy. And really, according to his producer, Bill Harback, you didn't have to be having a laugh every minute, but if you had a few, then it's a success. I mean, I think that was a different
Yes.
approach back then than what you might be expecting now. I think there's much more pressure on late night hosts now to be able to
Mhm.
hold the attention and to keep the momentum going, which I don't think I did not catch that kind of vibe from any of the production team that I interviewed from the Steve Allen era of The Tonight Show.
No, you're right. And now it's completely different because it's those views going viral on
Hmm.
YouTube.
True.
But what was I going to say? Um okay, I'm completely blanking out on what I was going to say. Um so
This
Steve
is easy
Allen.
to edit out. It's not live television.
No, I
So,
try to. Oh, well, we're just going to go with I was watching an episode of the Steve Allen show from 1966, 7, 8, one of those. And what I was noticing was I like this has everything I love about Steve Allen, but this episode's not very good, which may be more to your point of they were not trying to make every show every like second jam packed with laughs. They were just trying to put on an amusing show that people would watch and want to
mhm.
watch, which even by that time, when I watch other shows, I don't typically find the same mentality of like, let's just put on a show that people want to watch. It's usually like we're trying to be funnier or edgier or
Mhm.
go off the rails because it's the time period.
Was this the talk show that he did, one of the syndicated talk shows, or was
Yes.
this a variety show? Because he did a summer variety show a few times in the 60s, and I think later on in the early 80s he had one.
I'm not sure what you would call this. That it was the Steve Allen show. There were some interviews, but there were also comedy sketches. It had um, Mitzi. I'm blanking on her. Mitzi.
Mitzi Gaynor?
No,
No.
Charlie Brill was the other one. The married couple.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I can't place them. But you may be referring to either there were two syndicated shows
Yeah,
he did in the later 60s. One was for Golden West, and then the other one I'm trying to remember
Mitzi
off the top of my
McCall.
head. Okay. All right. Yeah. I think as the times were changing, I think they were still trying to do kind of outdo what they did in terms of stunts. And I think there was
Hmm.
one from that era where Steve was pasted with all kinds of dog food.
Oh
And I
yeah,
don't know if you saw that
yeah.
sketch.
I've
And
seen
then they
that.
unleashed a herd of, I think it must have been like 2 or 3 dozen dogs. They were all very
Yes.
friendly. But Steve was on the ground and they all came and they thought he was just quite the dish to eat
Yeah.
for dinner.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. Yeah, that came out of that. Um, yeah, and I'm trying to remember. Um, I think he presented. I don't know if it was during that era or not, but this might have been actually in the Westinghouse show between 62 and 64, where there was an early appearance of Aretha Franklin. Was one of the singers that he had on. I don't know as much about the syndicated show in the like 68 through 69 or 70
Yeah.
because there's so little available publicly
There's so little
on
of
those.
any of his stuff, which is sad.
Yeah.
And I remember hearing him on one of the talk shows in the 80s talking, had to have been Letterman, talking about how up until like relatively recently at that time, a lot of his stuff still existed, and then something happened where it was destroyed or wiped.
It was a mystery to some degree. I know that when I talked to him about that in 1997, he said that it was decided that at uh, one of the repositories for the kinescopes, because that's all they had. There was
Yeah.
no videotape and no film, other direct film. It was all just kinescopes filming
Yeah.
the television screen. But some guy in the storage facility just decided they needed more shelf space, and so it was disposed of. And so a lot of those
Yeah.
early programs, there are some that exist, and I think some exist by happenstance, where maybe a
Hmm.
local affiliate or a local station may happen to have done their own copy,
Yeah.
and then something will surface at some point. But I think out of 2.5 years, I don't know if it's like 30 or 40 hours, possibly. I mean, that might even be generous.
Yeah, I
There are
think it is.
clips somewhere that do appear,
Yeah.
and there are a few actual programs that appear. But it's even if we say it's like, less than 5%, that's still, that's still not a whole lot.
No, the clips that
Unfortunately,
no, yeah, the clips that I remember from the show are usually the ones that get replayed over and
over
over
and over.
again, like him
Mhm.
jumping into the vat of Jello,
Jello,
which
right?
so many times I've heard that story.
Mhm.
And then there's one where he's on his piano with the doll, the wind up I
Oh
think it's a
yeah.
wind up doll, and it
Hmm.
almost goes off, and then
Right.
its like skirt goes up. So
Right.
he's
It's
like,
classic Steve Allen because
yes,
what you can tell from that is he's reacting to everything that's going on. This is not like we're going to make the
no,
doll do this and then you have to say that. But he's totally reacting to it and having fun with that.
yes,
And then you hear the people in the background. You hear the people on the on stage with him. They're reacting too. And
yes,
so it's yeah, that's a great bit, and that's something that is on YouTube, and it's I think the title of it is called Steve Allen Rare Clip.
probably,
It's
yeah,
on there. So take and so your viewers can check that out. But that's a classic bit, and it actually begins. Um, I'm trying to remember exactly, everything that was covered in there, but like in 7 minutes,
yeah,
you see all the different things that he's able to do. So he starts off there, he's
mm-hmm.
playing the piano, a great jazz pianist. Then
Yes,
he has this bit, then he has the little opener
mm-hmm.
where he greets the audience and says a few things that were, semi-prepared or also spontaneous. Then they have the
Yeah,
bit with the doll coming in there, and he has fun with that. And then after that, that's followed by Skitch Henderson coming in there, and he and Steve do a duet where they're both playing piano, and then Steve sings. And to see all of that talent wrapped up into 7 minutes, how
yeah,
many people can actually do all of those things and do it in such a casual, unassuming way? In many ways, it's one reason why I felt compelled to write the book, which is that I don't think he got the credit that he really deserved
no,
because he
he
made it look
doesn't.
so easy.
Yes,
That how hard could this be? You see Fred Astaire or Gene Kelly dancing, and they don't sweat. They
no,
make it look easy. And the same thing with Andy Williams, that his singing is just so effortless, and his manner is casual, but that's sort of part of their shtick in a way, even though
yeah,
it came naturally to them, but it actually belies many, many hours of for them rehearsal.
yeah,
Whereas for Steve, he was just lucky that so much of it came naturally to him.
yes. And I don't know if late night would have become what it became if he wasn't the one to host it at that point in time, because before the Tonight Show we had Broadway Open House
Right,
with Maury Amsterdam and Jerry Lester.
right.
Maury Amsterdam would become known for Buddy on the Dick Van Dyke Show.
Yep.
Jerry Lester would then be promptly forgotten after a few appearances on Names the Same. I That's the only thing I've seen Jerry Lester, and I have not seen much. I don't particularly care for Jerry Lester.
It's somewhat to me somewhat shocking that from time to time on different sitcoms from the 60s that they still rerun. I think That Girl is one, and there are a few
Yeah.
others that all of a sudden I'll see someone that "Gee, who is that?" And I look at the credit, and it was just a small part in the show. It's Jerry Lester. And I'm thinking, oh
Wow.
my gosh, he just has this little bit thing on a sitcom. And it's unfortunate that he had a place in early
Mm-hmm.
television history, and that there really wasn't any place for him to fit in very well in his later years, which is unfortunate. Unlike the co-host, unlike Maury Amsterdam,
Right.
becoming an iconic comic actor,
Yes.
and not only just acting, but he had a hand in a number in creating a number of the things that he did on the Dick Van Dyke Show, even working stuff out with Richard Deacon, some of the
Yeah.
hilarious bits that the two of them did together. But yeah, Jerry Lester has been in many ways sadly forgotten. Uh,
There's a
but
few
I
people
think that
like that.
with Steve, I think it's a good point that you make that Steve showed that you could do something more spontaneous
Mm-hmm.
if you had that ability, because you could not get, and the writers would be the first to tell you that you could not write for somebody that would have to do
No.
90 minutes times 4 to 5 nights a week. You can't write that. You can blueprint things for them to be able to
Yeah.
be aware of, and then they can kind of take it from there. But you need to have somebody that is naturally off the cuff,
Hmm.
and so that's where I think that in some ways that became more difficult for Jack Parr. I think he had to prepare a lot more. Not that he had to script everything out, but it seemed, I think just, even any kind of an honest assessment of his work, that he had to work a lot harder to make The Tonight Show work for him. And I think it took a lot more out of him to make it as successful as it was, even though he was really great in doing the serious one-on-one interviews. I think that's where
Yes.
he excelled. I think that Steve brought the desk, Jack Parr brought the couch into late.
Yes.
I think that's how a number of historians have phrased it. I was going
Yep.
to say couched it, but phrased it is probably better.
The thing
Mhm.
is with Jack Parr, there's also not much of that. There's a lot of his serious interviews, and
Mhm.
then the rest of the clips I feel like are just him having a mental breakdown on air because he was
Yeah.
not a calm or even keeled guy by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that was hard to do. And then I think that last straw when he walked off the
Yeah.
program, that became, very dramatic. And it was just hard. I think he would have really had great difficulty lasting much longer.
Yeah.
Uh, so in many ways, the Johnny Carson years were more of a throwback to the kind of Tonight Show that Steve did,
Yes.
where it was more lighthearted, more of a variety. But you could still do the serious interview from time to time. But then
Hmm.
the comedy sketches and all the comic bits going out into the audience. I mean, all those things that Steve started, Johnny was able to either continue and or take to another level.
Yes.
So that's and the whole point of my book is it all started with Steve.
Yes. Which it did. And one of yeah, in the book you mentioned this, like how Steve, I think it's in the book where like Steve, I'm looking at the book, meant like how like Johnny stole a lot of things from Steve or borrowed them if we're going to be more generous without saying this is where this came from. And maybe it was in the book. I'm not remembering all of my where I saw things. How Steve almost had a show in the time slot that Letterman would eventually take after the Tonight Show, and
Right.
we now know it as late night with
Mhm.
whoever current host is. Steve almost had that time slot, and Johnny Carson vetoed it, whether that was
Mhm.
official or just out of like, hey, rather you not do this, whatever the reason was. Um, it's that's kind of interesting, and then it's like, well, we would go from Karnak to the Question Man. That would not work.
Right. And not that Steve was going to rehash his old show again
Right.
in the early 80s, but this is really more speculation, but it might be kind of a logical uh,
Yeah.
analysis of it, where the NBC execs, and I'm trying to remember which one it was, but they were pitching the idea to him. I mean, they approached him. He wasn't looking, but they were saying,
No.
"How would you like to come back to late night? You can follow Johnny on there." And I hope that the executive, who was a big network exec in television history, and I
Yeah.
think he had worked on all the networks, but he was doing it for NBC at the time.
It
Um,
wasn't Fred Silverman, was
it
it?
might have it might have been Fred Silverman. Yeah, that might have been the one.
Okay.
But this would be a great idea. Why don't you come back? We really could use you here. And Steve, I think to hear him tell it was he was on vacation, I think in the Bahamas at the time.
Yeah.
And he and Jane were down there. And so he kind of, thought it over, and I think he was ready to say, "Why don't I'm ready. I think I can go ahead and give it a shot." But then, as you say, and as I've mentioned in the book,
Hmm.
that essentially it was Johnny that had vetoed that concept, unfortunately. And the thing is that I think the network was afraid that Steve was going to claim royalties for things that Johnny was doing that Steve had started.
Yeah.
And as far as I could tell from the Allen family and from Jane and everybody associated with Steve, that was not the point. And Steve was not looking to earn more money for things that Johnny was doing that Steve had
Right.
originated. But from a personal standpoint, he simply would have appreciated more of a nod or a thank you or just some kind of
Right.
acknowledgement in much the same way as David Letterman did, or
Yeah.
Jay Leno did, or Conan O'Brien did.
Right. The
And
suit of magnets that Letterman did, and then all those Velcro.
yeah,
That's
and
all Steve Allen, and he
and
would
I and I think
mention that.
that the point that either Steve or his family made was that when he would see these things in later years of late night, he felt like a proud grandpa. He says that,
Aw.
wow, look at I started something and here they're taking it to another level. But when it's implied or it seems very protective about wanting to make sure Johnny got the credit for it, and there really was no reason. I mean, you can't argue with the fact that Johnny had the seat for 30 years. So it's
Right.
amazing he could do that, and nobody is trying to diminish that from him.
Right.
And so it was when Johnny said a number of really wonderful things about Steve after Steve had passed away, that Jay Meadows was interviewed, and she said,
Hmm.
we really appreciate hearing Johnny being able to say these things, and I wish I could remember them exactly, but they're in the book. But her comment was, she says, "I wish he could have said them while Steve was still alive."
Yeah.
I think that was the one thing that even though their relationship was cordial, but I think it could have been closer had maybe there not been that level of insecurity, perhaps there at Johnny's end, there was
Yeah.
no need for it because nobody was questioning his stature in the pantheon of late night television hosts.
Right. And there is only so many thing. There are so many only. There are only so many things you can do. So
But you did that grammatically correctly.
thank you. So like I think there is something to what Steve is saying where we can't be like, oh, that he stole it, but the fact that he didn't even acknowledge someone did it before him, like in the case of Carson, is sort of like, oh, okay, you don't have to mention it every time, but like,
Mhm.
like not this isn't an original thing. Your take on it maybe, but
The thing I would add
yeah,
is that Steve did so many different things
yes,
between songwriting and playing the piano and writing books and doing a whole bunch of different things that it did not it for him. And I just want to be sure it's clear he was not obsessed with making sure that people remembered him to get
oh
that
yeah,
kind of
no,
credit because late night was one of many things he did, and so
right,
it wasn't crushing that these kinds of things would happen. But I'm
yeah,
glad that when around the time the book came out, and then I was also interviewing the current executives at NBC, including Rick Ludwin, who was the vice president of, and I'm not sure if this is the exact title, but I think variety and late night programming. You know how
yeah,
titles change over the years, but
yeah,
he was the person that they sent me to talk about that. And he wanted to make it very clear that NBC acknowledged that this is, Steve Allen, really contributed and played that role. Created that genre of late night. And they acknowledged that Pat Weaver, who was the vice president of programming at the time, was
yeah,
certainly brilliant in knowing or foreseeing the viability of that kind of programming and being able to discover and utilize Steve Allen's talents to form what became the original Tonight Show and the ground floor of late night television as we know it.
Right. Also, with what I know about Steve, even if Steve could have had a tenure like Johnny Carson's of 30 years, I don't think he would have wanted it because he did
Mhm.
so many things
Right.
and he had his music, he had his writing. TV was just something he did that brought it all together. It wasn't his life where it's like, if I'm not on TV, then who am I? There were
Right. It
other
wasn't part of
things.
his identity. And
No.
in some ways it seemed, at least the impression I got was that after Johnny retired from the Tonight Show, he really didn't do anything of that magnitude. After.
No. He just sailed on his yacht, the
Mhm.
Serengeti. That's or and went to Africa. That was
Mhm.
literally Johnny Carson's retirement.
And all the credit to him. I mean, he certainly earned that.
Yeah.
I think Steve lived for the stimulation that all of his different things
Yes.
did for him. And just to give an example of there was when I was in his office in 1997, and I said something that he thought, oh, this would be a great idea. He pulls his dictaphone out and he dictates a letter during the middle of my interview. And say, I don't want to forget this. And he dictated the letter there and he said, okay, so I've got it done. And I know that when he would go on vacation, Jane Meadows had this story about how when he would go swimming in the morning, they always made sure that he had a dictaphone at each end of the swimming pool because depending on, if he had an idea, there would be a dictaphone there for him to be able to dictate it to. And that's how he wrote so many of his books. They all
Okay.
began as, the drafts all began with what he dictated there. So it was amazing just how quick that mind was going. It's really,
It's
once in a century perhaps kind of talent.
yeah. That and his books. Wow, my voice went high. There his books are on so many different topics where I'm like,
Mhm.
how does one person write about? Sure, he has his memoirs, he has books about being funny. I have a few of his books back there, but then he has the book. I forget which talk show, not talk show, game show he's promoting it on in the 70s about China, which was
Mhm.
probably because of Jane Meadows being
Right.
born
Mhm.
there.
Correct. Yeah.
Um, then there was the Vulgarians at the Gate,
Mhm.
Dummeth. There's a whole bunch of books on various topics where I'm like, you can't possibly be an expert on all of these things. Where does this come from?
Well, I think it came from his innate sense of curiosity.
Yes.
And so even though he didn't have a college degree, I don't believe he'd finished. And now I'm feeling terrible that that's a kind of a basic fact that I should know, but I've somehow forgotten that. But I know that he attended
Yeah.
Drake for a while in Iowa, but then he went to Arizona State, in part because of the climate. He was having a terrible time with asthma
Yes.
there at Drake. But at
He's one of the few people you will not see with a cigarette at that
yes,
time period.
yeah, and I think the whole point was that he he really, even though he might not have finished with a college degree, he still had this thirst for knowledge. He
Yes.
never tired of it, and so he was always wanting to learn about this or that topic that intrigued him, and he read up on it. And he became knowledgeable about it. So and kept up with the newspapers, and it was just somebody that you could, when you listen to him speaking, you can tell, he's a very well-read, widely read
Yes.
personality.
Yes. And that comes across in a lot of his interviews.
Right.
Not so much in his appearances on game shows, but that's mainly because game shows are very limited in what
I
you
would
can do.
say. Hmm.
Unless we're talking early, What's My Line? But like, I've Got a
Right.
Secret when he was
Hmm.
hosting it, especially the later version of I've Got a Secret. I'm just like, oh, like this seems a little too dumb by Steve Allen standards
Hmm.
in terms of
Yeah.
like not an intelligent show, not so much like, oh, this is too silly. It's just like this you probably would rather be doing something else than hosting this show right now.
But he had fun doing it, and
Yeah.
so I think that he was a natural. And I think the thing is that it didn't take too much out of him because you could just set him down and he kind of knows what to do, uh,
Yes.
and can interact with everybody around him. He's very, was very aware of his surroundings and of the people there. That it was a joy, and I could sense that just just in sitting with him there in his office, and just the kind of mind that he had. And at that time, he was. I'm trying to recall if he was I think in his early 70s already by that time. So 19. I think he was around 75 because he
Okay.
was born in 1921 and I met him in 1997. So probably 76 already and going on 77 then at the
Yeah.
time. So yeah, and still, very active and very curious about things. It's an amazing guy.
Yes. Um yeah, and he passed away not too long afterwards. What was it? Three
Yeah, it was
years
in
after?
2000.
Yeah.
It was in late October of 2000. And it was really unfortunate because
Yeah.
he was involved in a fender bender, a very minor, almost like a scrape.
Yeah.
Uh, and,
And they
and but he didn't realize he refused medical attention, and they didn't realize that there was a lot of internal bleeding going on
yeah.
there. And he drove himself back to his son's house. He even made a joke to the other driver about what some people won't do to get my autograph, at the
Oh
scene of.
no. That poor other
I
driver.
know. Uh, and so he felt kind of not quite right, and he felt very sleepy, and he took a nap, and sadly that was the end there. And so yeah,
Yeah.
the family was really saddened, and this was at the time, uh, I had met him about 2.5 years earlier, and he and or folks in his office were helping me to either get contact information or to kind of set things up with the different people that I interviewed. And
Mm.
early on, I guess it was maybe mainly for the record, that they said, we're not getting these interviews for you. Uh, we don't want to be viewed as doing that. But then
Right.
I would be talking with, let's say, Steve Lawrence, Needy Gourmet, and they say, Steve told us about you. And then they started saying things that were very nice that I guess that was a nice way of opening the doors so that it wasn't as if, we only have 10 minutes to give you. So what do you want? But rather they were kind of much more open. They were very welcoming, just about everybody that I interviewed. Uh, Nobody was in a hurry. They wanted to talk about their time with Steve and how wonderful and how glorious it was. And so I got the sense that uh, Steve had enough good words about me to say to them that they were willing to take me seriously when I sat down or either in person or doing something on the phone with him. So I'm very grateful for that opportunity to be able to, it's not like you're in a signing line at a book signing where you
No.
only have a minute to talk to the author, but you can actually explore more in depth about what their approach to television was or what their feelings were, what it
Yeah.
was like at that time. And I think as these these interview subjects started to kind of warm up, you could feel that they were reminiscing, rather than
Yeah.
just simply recounting, but they were reminiscing about, what a fun time they had, or what their impressions were of Steve doing this or that on the
Mm.
show. So these were all nice opportunities for me.
That's fantastic. Unfortunately, we've lost a lot of the people from that era in
All right.
television.
Yeah, I'm glad that I was able to get to them before they left us. So,
Yes.
Jonathan Witters, Carl Reiner, Sid Caesar,
Mm-hmm.
all those folks there, and all the different people that you've seen, the writers that were there, Bill Harback, although Bill Harback, was with us for I think until I think maybe about what 5 or 6 years ago. He lived to be in his late 90s, which was amazing.
Yes.
Um, and I would say, his name is not as big of a name as perhaps it should be, but what he became later known for was the Hollywood Palace. I don't know if that's a show you've heard of, but it was a big show on ABC where it was a variety show with a different series of hosts. Although
Okay.
most of the time, um, not most, but a lot of the time, it would be Bing Crosby would be the host.
Yes.
Judy
Okay.
Garland hosted it. There were a number of other big names that that would take a turn. I think Fred Astaire hosted it, but it was really a lot of in many ways like an updated vaudeville kind of show.
Yeah.
But Bill Harback was Bill Harback and Nick Vanoff were producing it, and Bill Harback also became well known for the Kennedy Center honor shows early on. So he was, greatly involved in that. But he was the first producer of the network Tonight Show, and had worked with Andy Williams in the past. He was the manager for Kay Thompson and the Williams brothers. So, he and even an actor of small note.
Yeah.
And he really could have become, he had certainly had the looks if he wanted to pursue that. But the point I wanted to make about him was that he, number one, was so enthusiastic. I think that he was one person that kept on encouraging me by really trying to remember things that had gone on or things that he really felt strongly about uh, working with Steve. And one thing that really impressed him, he told me, was, and I think you might have seen this in the book, was that when they were asking if he would be interested in producing this show, they needed a producer that could be more spontaneous in making
Mm-hmm.
changes on air, which the other producer was having difficulty with. But they let Bill come in and observe what was going on, and
Mm-hmm.
he watched Steve read letters from viewers across the country. And one of them was a letter objecting to him having kissed Lena Horne,
Oh yeah.
an African American performer, on the air. And they were saying, "How dare you do something like that?" And Steve, read the letter on the air and said, "This man is sick. There's no place for this on television."
Yep.
And that he really stood up. I mean, this is during an era where I don't know if how many other hosts would have gone and taken that kind of risk. But when
Right.
Bill Harback saw that, he said, "This is how I think as well. This is for me." And that's where he decided to agree to serve as producer. And not only that, but became really, really good friends with Steve. So he was very encouraging with me as I was working through trying to get to different stages of writing the book. And the thing that I'll remember the most about him was that even, a number of years after the book had come out, I would get a call from him, I think at least twice, maybe three times, out of the blue. And he said, "I just wanted to let you know, I just finished reading your book again. And I just love it, just brought everything back to me." And I thought, if for no other reason,
Yeah,
just
that's
to
the
hear
best.
somebody like that say it, and he says, "I want to thank you. You brought all these memories back. That it really warmed my heart.
Yeah,
To have him stay in touch like that. So I always remember him for that wonderful memory."
that is very cool. I'm loving hearing you talk about your experiences talking to all of these people because my generation that's really all we have at this point is people who knew these people telling us
Mm.
stories about like Steve Allen or what the early days of television were like because we have kinescopes but not that many of them
Hmm.
and those that we do have may be in poor quality and there's not that many of us who go back and want to watch them because there's a million different things that you can watch across a million different streaming services, and
Sure.
there's not like the Steve Allen show on Netflix or Tubi or something like
Hmm.
that.
Yeah,
Um,
no, there's still some clips there. I don't know if either if I had sent this to you or if I pointed
mhm.
you in this direction, but in the 60s, he did a summer replacement comedy hour show. I think it was for the Smothers Brothers. I think he might have been doing it for like 7 or 8 weeks. But some
That's
of the
an
people
interesting
that
change.
yeah, some of the people that got their start and really got great exposure on that show, Ruth Buzzy, as you know, who
Hmm.
recently passed away. This is right around the time, right on the cusp of her. Uh, and if I recall correctly, it was I think it was George Slaughter, the producer of Laugh-In, who saw her on the Steve Allen show there and thought that she would be a great addition to the Laugh-In cast. So. So there you
I
go.
that was not planned, but I have his book right next to me. That's my
Oh,
next
wonderful.
read. Yeah.
Yeah. No, the thing that they're known, one of the great things they're known for was they did a, spoof on telethons, fundraising telethons,
Hmm.
and and the one they did on the show was called the Prickly Heat Telethon.
Yes.
Have you seen that clip?
Not yet, but that kept
Uh,
coming up.
yeah, so that's one that'll be a lot of fun. And Ruth Buzzy was kind of like the tote board girl. There, with the big grin on her
Yeah.
face and the outfit there, and then she would show just how little or how much money they lost since the last time they checked. There with
Losing
and
money was
then
an option. Okay.
what's that?
Losing money was an option.
Yes. The amount of money that they raised had gone down after a certain guest would do their thing. John Biner was on there. There were quite a number of folks that were on that. But yeah, that's in many ways that's sort of slightly updated, but still classic Steve Allen. Going through
Yeah.
that. That's one thing there. And I'm sorry how I somehow got on top of that. Um, Maybe you can guide me as to what I was trying to say.
I'm just enjoying listening to you speak, so we're just going with the flow. Um, yeah, Smothers Brothers.
All right.
He was the Smothers Brothers replacement,
Hmm.
which then somehow became George Slater, Laughing.
Well, the George saw Ruth Buzzy on that
Yeah.
program and wanted to, reach out to her.
Yeah.
So and I didn't really know that until after she had passed away, and I was reading some of the recollections of her. And so, yeah, so Steve was always one to be open to new talent. I mean, Tim Conway was one addition there that I'm trying to remember. It was actually Rose Marie who was doing a tour promoting the Dick Van Dyke Show, and
Mhm.
she was in I think it was Cleveland or Columbus, Ohio, one of the cities there, and she saw Tim Conway co-hosting a local morning movie show,
I
and so
believe
this
that's
is
in the book as well.
yeah, and and what they were doing was they were basically getting hosts to present in between the segments of the movie they were going to show
Mhm.
during the I know 90 minutes or so that they had the show, and I guess they became a thing. They were really clowning around. And they were hilarious. And in fact, sometimes their bits would run so long that they couldn't finish the movie there by the end of that, their allotted time. But Rosemarie saw that and she asked for, I guess, a clip of some of the antics that Tim was involved in. And she wanted to bring it to, I think, to Steve and
Mhm.
also to Carl Reiner. Or I think it was to Steve. I think that might have been it.
Yeah, and you also mentioned that sometimes they overran the time, so they show the end of the movie on
Right.
Fridays, which might be my
Hmm.
favorite part of that.
Yeah. And so what this led up to was that Steve at that time in I think 1961, this is after his NBC series had ended, but he still had a show that wasn't as successful, but it was on ABC, primetime show,
Mm-hmm.
and he added Tim Conway to the cast. Although
Oh,
the one point, I don't know if that, I think that's in book two, was that Tim Conway at the time was not known as Tim Conway, he was Tom Conway. Uh,
yes,
and,
that is.
and so they discovered that they already had Tom Conway in the Actors Union. And so they're going to need to change his name somehow. And I don't know if it was, I think it was Steve or somebody had suggested, and maybe it was Steve that
I
says,
think
well,
in the
then why
book
don't
it
you
said.
change it to I? We're just essentially, we're just going to dot the O, he said. That was the joke there. And then Tom became Tim Conway. And then the rest is history. But the other actors that were on that ABC show there, so you had Tim Conway, Jim Nabors was a
Mm-hmm.
newcomer then, and the Smothers Brothers were newcomers then.
Mm-hmm.
They're two, that kind of network programming. So all of them got great exposure, and their names live on.
Yes. And I think one thing that I'm curious about, and I'm wondering if you have any insight. So, Steve Allen was not a lover of rock and roll. He was a jazz guy, even though
Mhm.
he had Elvis on before Ed Sullivan did.
Mhm.
Um, what was that all about? Because like he really did not like rock and roll.
Uh, I would have to say that in some ways it was kind of for me, and maybe this is a bit charitable to say, uh, rock and roll was more of a blind spot for him. Uh,
Okay.
I think that he just didn't really think it compared to like the Great American Songbook or to jazz.
Right. I
So
mean, it's not as complicated as jazz in its most basic forms, but there are like prog rock gets
yeah, I
pretty.
mean, it can
Yeah.
get you can get very sophisticated. I
Yeah.
mean, just to give an example, like the Moody Blues or the Who writing Tommy. I mean, all of that
Yeah.
going in there. But I think particularly early rock and roll, it
Yeah.
it was
Rockabilly is three chords.
yeah. So it's the three chord rock and roll, and I think it rubbed Steve the wrong way. Although he did have a great respect for Elvis as a performer. I mean, he said he can captivate an audience, and that
Yes.
takes a level of talent that was necessary. But I think the point that he and particularly Jane Meadows and Bill Allen, their son,
Mm-hmm.
made was that the Steve Allen comedy variety show, the primetime show he had, was really focused on comedy with
Yeah.
some music involved. So this is not a music show,
No.
not like Perry Como or Dinah Shore or Andy Williams, where they would
Right.
want to do a lot of musical numbers, but the guests had to be able to participate in some
Yeah.
kind of a comic role. So they decided, and perhaps controversially, if
Yeah.
looking back, that Elvis could do his new hit Hound Dog, but they would want to do it in a more comic way. So that's where they decided that he would sing it in tie, tuxedo and tails
Yeah.
to the Basset Hound, similarly attired.
Yeah.
And so I think there are many rock purists that have never forgiven him for that. Although it has to be said that that performance was something that was, that predated the Ed Sullivan Show, because Ed
Yes.
didn't want to have he didn't think that Elvis was wholesome enough to have on a family type show. But then to hear the account of Steve and his family by the end of that hour where Steve was
Yeah.
had Elvis on the show, Colonel Parker was already on the phone trying to get Elvis to jump over to do the Sullivan Show. And Elvis, as according to the accounts from the Allen family that I have in my book, felt a certain loyalty to Steve Allen because he was willing to give him
Yeah.
the airtime and to have him on there. But I think that they all agreed that the best platform for Elvis would be on a show like Ed Sullivan, where you
Yeah.
could really focus on the music and not have to look for some kind of a comedy angle
Yeah.
to put into that kind of a context. I think at least as far as the Allens were concerned, no hard feelings. They were very proud to have been able to
Yeah.
get Elvis on there, and that particular broadcast actually outdrew because Sullivan and Allen were
Hmm.
competing against each other, and they outdrew the Sullivan Show in the ratings for that week. And I guess what's really amazing is that you look at the date of the show, and I think the date of the show of that episode was in late June of 1956. And you don't really think of network uh, primetime shows, and especially those that are a series, running into the summer.
No.
Usually the practice became having other programming or reruns or a summer replacement show,
Right.
but actually having your local, I mean, your weekly primetime show running
Right.
well in the summer weeks.
Growing up, I remember the TV season always ended around the school year. Whether that was
Hmm.
2 weeks before, two
Yeah.
weeks after, depends on the show.
Hmm.
But it was always around mid June.
Right. Yeah, and then now today, you can get what 8 to 12 episodes, and you basically have a season,
Yes.
and you could actually binge them if you wanted to,
Yeah.
because they all drop at the same time. So it's a whole different approach to programming, but it's
Yeah.
amazing. I mean, just imagine the kind of time that was necessary to put into producing a 1 hour primetime show.
Yeah.
What's interesting to me is that the writers had to point out that they said it was actually easier for them as writers to write for Steve Allen, 4 nights a week in late night, because
Hmm.
he could do the interview, he could kind of, work with the audience or do the color commentary of people
Yeah.
walking down the street, all of those things, and they can write a sketch here or there or come up with different ideas. But they said that for a primetime comedy variety show, they had to be much more tightly scripted because everything had to end in 1 hour, and they had all these guests to
Right.
put on comedy bits, and everything had to time out in quite the precise
Hmm.
fashion, and that was a lot more work than 4 nights a week of doing something more off the cuff. So interesting insights I got from the writers.
That is very cool.
In
And
in fact, one of them,
yeah.
I should add, is
Hmm.
now I think if his name didn't escape me, but his Herb Sargent became the first supervising writer of Saturday Night Live.
Yeah.
So, it shows how much respect they had that SNL had to reach out to somebody with that level of experience to basically kind of oversee the writing during those early years of the show.
Yes. And is there anything else you want to add before we wrap up?
Well, this has gone by quickly. I hope quickly for you as much as it is for me, but I had a great time.
Thank
Um,
you.
I'm trying to think
I
of
did too.
if there was anything else here. I think you covered a lot of ground, so it's much appreciated what we were able to do today.
Thank you. And I'm still like I can't tell you how much I appreciate this because I remember the first time I read this book, your book, I'm like it would be kind of cool to talk to him. And now I'm talking to him, so talking to you, so like it's like, 23-year-old me would be freaking out, and it's pretty cool. So thank
Well, I'm
you.
glad I'm glad to be here to talk with you about that. So it's been a blast.
Yes. And I'm gonna wrap up. Thank you for joining me on
Very good. Yeah, no, thank you for
yeah.
having me, Allison. This is really a lot of fun.
And until next time, it's been me, Allison Lips, with Ben Alba. Check out his book, Inventing Late Night, wherever you get your books online. Until next time, this is... Wow. I am all over the place, but...
That's okay. This is a spontaneous moment.
Yes, it would be great to have Steve Allen with us. Well, until next
He'd be
time...
cackling.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Until next time, this is Allison Lips for Greetings from the Idiot Box. Remember, television is a medium, neither rare nor well done. Bye.